Okay, I do think we're gonna have to get started. We've got a good crowd already, and I'm sure a few more will trickle in that are coming in from lunch that just wrapped up, given that the program earlier this morning was a little delayed. Welcome, everybody. My name is Bina Hussein, and I'm an Associate Director at the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. I'm also one of the organizers of the Global Energy Forum. I manage the program, so I'm especially delighted to see you all here and to welcome you to Abu Dhabi. I hope you have enjoyed the day so far, and that I promise that you still have a day and a half of very interesting programming coming up. So I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the program as well, and that you get to meet a lot of great people, build new relationships, and catch up with old friends as well. We'll be discussing the report, Energy Sector Diversification, Meeting Demographic Challenges in the MENA region. And I will introduce the panel in a minute, but I wanted to take some time to talk a little bit about the report before we kick off the discussion. First of all, I would like to thank RBC, who has sponsored the report. It wasn't planned, but it became a series of reports that we have done over the years. This is the third installment that is focused on economic diversification, and every year we have launched a different report in Abu Dhabi. 3 years ago, we did a report on women in energy and how the energy sector could play a role in increasing female participation at large in the workforce. Last year, it was a report on sovereign wealth funds and how the Gulf, or whether the Gulf, is using it as a means to reach economic diversification. And then this year, we are looking at the demographic challenges in the MENA region. And I think it's a report that actually ties all three together pretty well, because all of it plays a role when you talk about economic diversification and meeting the demographic challenges. This is a really important topic for the region, and it's probably the most pressing issue that the region will need to deal with today and in the coming decades to come. I know that the region also is dealing with a lot of other issues, but this is probably, regardless of whether people are focusing on it or not, whether they're talking about it or not, the most important issue to solve and to come up with a plan, as it is expected that the region will see some of the largest growth in population over the next few decades. Just to give you some numbers, today it is estimated that it's about, the MENA region at large has about 440 million people. By 2050, it is expected to have a population of 730 million. According to the World Bank, by that time, more than 300 million jobs are required to meet the demand. The region at large also tends to have an incredibly young population. And so how the next generations are going to evolve will impact the economy and the policies that these countries are implementing. Without any action, part of the region or certain countries may witness turmoil. We're seeing it currently, or have seen it in the past few months or even in the past year, happening again in Algeria, in Lebanon, and in Iraq. Now, within the report, I looked at 4 different countries, 3 in the Gulf and 1 in North Africa, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Kuwait, and then realizing that Algeria is incredibly different from the Gulf, but a very important hydrocarbon economy nonetheless, and expect to see some of the largest changes, Algeria. One of the things that and this is my opinion and they may disagree, is the rentier state or remaining in hydrocarbon economy predominantly won't help them long term. It will be too much of a burden on the state if things don't get privatized. Public sector employment, especially among the nationals, is incredibly high. Female participation is incredibly low, even though women tend to be higher educated in all of these countries. And economies need to be opened up. These are some of the key takeaways that you'll find in the report that you all have on your seats. So the other issue is education, knowledge, and skills. Anyway, so we have a great panel here that are far greater experts on this session, on this topic than I am, so I'm excited to hear from them myself as well. We've got in the far end, Nicole Goldin. She's a fellow with the Atlantic Council. Fahad Alturki, VP or Vice President of Research with CAPSARC, which is also one of our knowledge partners. Karen Young, a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and Chadi Salloum, partner with Morgan Lewis. Thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to have you. Sorry. Nicole, I want to start with you. You have done, yeah, sorry, we're going to lift a mic share and, it will be a good party. You have done, and you're currently researching as well, and writing a report on the demographic challenges in different countries than I have covered for the Atlantic Council. We're actually launching a project at the Atlantic Council under our Middle East program that is focused on unleashing human potential. I think I got that right. But Nicole, you've done a lot of research also on South Asia, Southeast Asia, just to bring in the region in focus that the Global Energy Forum has. And I would love to get a little bit of a historical context from you on the demographic dividend historically from Southeast Asia, but also compare it a little bit to the MENA region, if you could.
Thank you. Thanks, Bina. Great to be with my fellow panelists and great to be with you all. Thanks so much for joining us. When I think about demographic challenges, as Bina said, I like to look back and using some of the historical context from Southeast Asia, in particular in East Asia, think about the demographic opportunity. And I think that's one of the aspects of this discussion that I'm excited about. Some of you may know, if you refer to fairly recent history over 1960 through about 1990s, there was very, very rapid economic growth in many of the East Asian tiger countries and the other Southeast Asian nations, often referred to as the East Asian economic miracle. And demographers and economists that have studied that period and looking at some of that population structure I've come back to say that as much as half of that rapid economic growth, over 10% a year, steadily over those 30 years, can be attributed to what's known as this demographic dividend. And it starts with the foundation of having a very favorable population structure. So to think about it in context with where we are in terms of the Arab region, in 1960, in these 8 what they call the high-performing Asian economies that really make up this economic miracle, including those tigers, in 1960, at the onset of this period, the average population in the region under age 25 was 60%. 60%, and about 40% of that was aged under 15 alone. So putting that into context with the Arab region today, as Bina was saying, it's still quite a young region and quite a young continent. The average average percent of the population under 15 in the Arab region, in the MENA region, is about 30%, 31%. And the under 25 ranges from about 40% in Tunisia to about 55% in Jordan. Saudi is about 44%. UAE is actually a little bit of an outlier on the lower end of about, I think, 25%. I'm sure I can be corrected. But on average, again, it is still quite young. So in terms of the demographic challenge, I still see it as a demographic opportunity in waiting. The other interesting piece is thinking ahead to the next 20 or even 30 years and taking a slightly longer view and thinking about that opportunity for that second demographic dividend. So one of the things we might want to talk about today is how do we think about investments today as this current youth demographic, that current 15 to 24-year-old in 20 years, 30 years will still be likely part of that working population, but starting to go towards the end. And then how do we make those investments now and think about not only the opportunities for those immediate demographic dividends and economic growth from the current youth population, but thinking ahead over the next 25 years and what can be going forward. Now, of course, the population structure isn't enough, right? It's not just enough to say we have a young population and we have a lot of folks that can go into the workforce. This is where the policy piece comes in, and this is where some of the other challenging trends that I hope we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about in terms of education, in terms of employment, in order to turn that favorable population structure into that demographic dividend. So I'll kind of stop there with laying the groundwork and hope we can come back and talk a little bit more about where we are in some of those aspects as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know Karen has done a lot of work on generational equity as well, but I'll come back to that in a moment. First, I'd like to turn to Chadi and actually kind of zoom in a little bit on the Gulf itself and kind of get your take as a person who has worked a lot with different investors in especially the UAE, but in the Gulf at large, different stakeholders. What is the evolution of the efforts that they have taken here to diversify the economy? What are some of your observations, and what do you see as some of the challenges that the UAE is dealing with today and other Gulf countries?
Thank you very much. And again, thank you for joining us. I think if you look back, for the past 20, 30 years, you could see the diversification that has occurred in the economy, even in the period that I've been here for the past 10 years, in terms of attempts by the government, solid attempts by the government to basically diversify the economy. Whether, for example, we heard today 12 gigawatts of renewable energy projects spearheaded by the UAE, whether in the UAE or globally at the end of the day. Having said that, I think there are effectively challenges. And these challenges, I see them in two buckets. Challenges in terms of access and in terms of consistency. And when I speak about access, one of the main drivers to diversification is effectively, from my standpoint, looking at my background at the end of the day and what I've achieved in terms of being here today, is education. I think education is a key driver. And it's about, a lot has been done in terms of investing in education, but I think there should be more of a continued focus on investing in education in all stages. Investing more in research based universities, whereby the education development is in a parallel path with economic development, and that's really important at the end of the day in terms of ensuring that the educational institutions are of a certain credibility, and they offer the let's just say they offer the fertile ground for ideas, and these ideas could be exported to the outside or could be developed internally and provide opportunities. The other issue in terms of access that I see is more access by talent and access to talent. I think access by talent is some of the issue that you talked about, which is access by women to the various drivers of the economy at the end of the day, and affording them the opportunities to truly contribute. And I tell you, from my own personal experience, having worked for 10 years with major government entities and the private sector, and I say that as the proud husband and father of a girl. I mean, some of the most talented people that I've worked with in the UAE are women. I mean, they're very motivated. They take ownership in terms of projects. and giving them that opportunity to grow further, which part of it has to be policy driven, and part of it is societal as well, obviously is key. And access to talent is, I mean, it's important, and I always see it as key in terms of developing local homegrown talent, you know, within the United Arab Emirates, within Saudi Arabia, within the countries that you talked about, you know, Kuwait or Oman or you know, other countries in the region. But I think, you know, also providing a fertile ground for talent from the outside to continue seeing the region as an attractive region is key also, because we are pretty much, I mean, we've been basically moving more and more to a very knowledge-intense economy. You have artificial intelligence, you have smart technologies, and with that, you need to attract talent, and talent that comes to the region. I mean, you know, myself and my partner who's here, you know, we've been here for like over 10 years, you know, you need to attract talent that is committed long-term to the region, not in terms of coming in for 3 years, putting our time and moving. And with that, there's an ecosystem that needs to be created at the end of the day in terms of affording this talent the opportunity to stay in the region and contribute, whether on the education front, whether on the training front, to training, you know, the local talent at the end of the day. So that's on the accessibility. On the consistency, you know, it's mostly structural, but you need consistency on a long-term basis from a policy perspective. You know, policy making needs to be consistent. You know, obviously, I think about it in terms of attracting investors to the region. I mean, as governments here tend to focus more on diversifying the economy and diversifying the sources of revenue, taxation becomes an issue, you know. And with that, you need to create a long-term policy that balances between your wishes to diversify the economy and your sources of revenue, and still being able to attract businesses from the outside, the private sector. And also, you know, we tend to be, which is rightfully so, excited when a milestone is achieved on a short-term basis, you know, on a medium-term basis. I mean, it's natural, but having a consistent policy program whereby we are truly focusing on, again, as they're trying, you know, throughout the region, and only time will tell, in a sense. And I've seen it for the past 10 years in the UAE, some of the successes. But these are programs that need a long time, need 15, 20, 30 years to be achieved in terms of achieving that level of diversification that's desired. So these are some of the challenges that I see. But again, from a diversification standpoint, I think there's been a lot of successes. And, you know, it's a region that has attracted a lot of talent. And, you know, I'd say humbly, I'm one of them. I mean, you know, when I was growing up in the region and I left the region, you know, at the time, you know, the region was not a place that I grew I'm professionally in North America. And to basically build a career in the UAE, I feel very proud that this has been a fertile ground for myself and others to basically be able to do so. So, yeah.
Thanks, Chadi. And you do touch upon a few important points, but I think one element is also changing the mentality of the local population and be willing to accept some of the changes that governments are implementing. I mean, Saudi Arabia, Fahad, is going through a lot of changes, and with the efforts around Vision 2030, you know, we see that there very clearly. What is your take, if you take a look at Saudi, how are they doing with implementing some of these policies? How is the population responding to it? And what else needs to be done in the short term that Saudi can actually reach success for the long term?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. And
I think you need to turn on your mic.
It's on.
No, it's red. Red is off. It's on? Okay. There we go.
So it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So Saudi have, as we all know, introduced the vision and the 13 vision realization programs back in 2016 and 2017. And since then, I think we've seen a major transformation happening in the kingdom. If I can summarize the goal of the vision is threefold. One is to reduce the 45% hydrocarbon sector within the economy to something of around 25% as stated in the vision. And at the same time, move away from one source of income that from experience have been unstable, which is oil revenue, and also looking at the future is probably more likely unsustainable. So these are the two main pillars, diversifying the economy, the economic base, the production base, and diversifying the sources of revenue. While doing that, they need to create more jobs for the Saudis. And the job market in Saudi Arabia have been very unique compared to, for example, the UAE or Kuwait. These are the closed countries, but also completely different than Algeria or Lebanon. It's a huge market. So you have around 13 million jobs are present in Saudi. The market creates about 100,000 jobs to 150,000 jobs every year. That's not enough. But yet, with that size of the market, you still have 1 million Saudis trying to find jobs, and the unemployment rate is around 13%, and stagnating at 13%. And I think there is a reason for the stagnation. The market have been opened, and there have been a lot of young Saudis who see the opportunity under the vision and coming to the market rather than being discouraged job seekers. They come to the labor market, so the size of the labor market grows at a faster rate than the economy creating jobs in the kingdom. So on average, the market creates 150,000 jobs per year with the growth of 2%, GDP growth of 2%. The job market, the labor force, grows on an annual basis of around 400,000 people. So you have additional about 300,000 people looking for jobs. And that's why the inflation or the labor unemployment rate is stagnating or even sometimes rising. And essential to that is opening the market for female employment. And I think that over the last year, we've seen a massive jump in the participation rate from very low base, 18% for female, to 23%. And to see that happening over a few years' time, 5 percentage point jump in the participation, that's, I think, in itself a great accomplishment for the vision in a very short period of time. Now, that not to say that a 23% participation is desirable. The target is definitely should be higher than that. Now, some of the challenges in the labor market in Saudi and the demography in the kingdom is traditionally Saudis prefer to work for the government. It's more secure jobs, pays higher, lower hours of working, so it's beautiful. Yeah, I work for the private sector, but I used to work for it. It's a dream, yeah. And there is also a mismatch. So even if you mentioned that females have higher degrees, probably the higher degrees are not what's required for the Saudi economy. So most of the Saudis have have college degree, 4-year bachelor degree. Vocational training is very low. But if you look at the main sectors that employs in the kingdom are the construction sector and the retail sector. Both the two sectors employ more than 400,000 individuals. Most of them are non-Saudi. So probably high education is not the solution. Probably a variety of vocational training and higher education and so on, providing all these alternatives can be solve the issue of the skill mismatch. Now, under the vision introduced many initiatives, some of which are targeting the demographic challenges in Saudi. Some by regulation, so forcing the private sector to employ Saudis, creating minimum wage, the Saudization ratio, raising the cost of the expats. So all of this is to transfer the preference of the Saudis from working from the public sector to working in the private sector. And also creating incentives, so wage subsidy, so for any company that meets some of their Saudization ratio, they're able to claim some wage subsidy for their Saudis that they employ. These are successful examples, and then there are also not or very slow progress in the privatization front that will create more jobs in the private sector. So if you think about some of the companies that we looked at, some of the government entities that are given for privatization, when I was in investment banking, we looked at some opportunities of investment, and to make these investments and privatization viable, you need to reduce the labor force within these entities by 50%. It's a massive reduction to make investment. So privatization hasn't picked up as fast as other initiatives within the vision. And then also under the vision, as the transformation toward the private sector and creating more jobs for the nationals, the encouragement of entrepreneurship. And under this, there have been two main initiatives. One is the regulatory environment. Saudi have introduced the bankruptcy law over the last few years, and this is an essential law if you want to encourage entrepreneurship. And the second thing that is under the fiscal sector reform program, which is one of the vision realization program, is to encourage the financial institutions to finance small and medium enterprises. Among the credit portfolio of the banking sector in Saudi Arabia, I think only 2% of that credit portfolio goes to small and medium enterprises. And the target is to push that to a higher level and above 5%. By creating incentives or guarantees as they move on and make development. All of these initiatives are likely to create more jobs, but I think I agree with Chadi that it will take time for these transitions to happen. It will take time for, if you change the business environment, to see the result of that change happening. For example, when I was working in the central bank, it will take a long time to change any item within the banking law. And we recently, within 3 years after the introduction of the vision, I counted around 9 set of laws either being enacted or updated within a very short period of time. Some of which are directly impacting like the business environment locally, and some of it meant to attract foreign investments to the kingdom. When you have this massive change in the business environment, even though it is an improvement, I think most of the investors, and I sensed that when I was in the investment banking, most of the investors take time to digest these changes, test these changes. Even in the index of ease of doing business, there is a grace period between introducing the law and counting it into the index to see an improvement. So there has to be a test period. So these changes are happening in the kingdom, I think, moving in the right direction. It has a cost, so the growth in the kingdom, the economic growth is slowing down to around 2% as expected for this year, compared to an average of 4 to 5% when oil prices were more than $100. But I think these are short-term pain for long-term gain that is likely to the Saudi economy will realize in the longer term, and ultimately it has to happen. I see the emergence of these positive changes happening already. Thank you.
Great. I know that Nicole was eyeing me to say something, but I'm going to turn to Karen first, because I'm sure that you will all have something to say after that to each other or something else. And then after that, I would also like to just say that I'd like this to be an engaging conversation. So if someone in the audience has a question, just raise your hand, catch my eye, and I will turn to you soon enough, because I think it's good if we just go back and forth, given the limited time we've got left. We've got about 30 minutes left, we're okay. But let's go back to the general equity, and also touching a little bit what Fahad just said, Chadi, Nicole. So, what do you see, or what will happen once the youth bulge is going into retirement? I mean, Nicole already mentioned it, okay, you got people that are entering the workforce today or in the next 10 years. In 20, 30, 40, 50 years, it will still be an issue, or I guess we're talking up until 2050. But what is happening, and what are some of the challenges that some of these countries have to take on in the immediate time frame to ensure that people actually do have, that there is generational equity?
Well, thank you, Bina, and thank you, everybody, for listening to us and being with us today. And thanks for your great report. I'll make my comments more on the GCC, which is what I study, and not on Algeria, because that's not a case that I know very well. But I'm so glad that you included it, because it is really sits in such opposition to some of the things that are unfolding in terms of economic policy across the Gulf right now. And I guess I would be a little bit contrarian. I mean, we've been talking about economic diversification in the GCC for 30, 40 years. We've had vision documents for a very, very long time. So this isn't new. But of course, there was a new urgency to the discussion after the decline in oil prices in late 2014. And what I see now is really economic diversification light, but it's in action and it's in movement. And it will have these long-term consequences that we'll see in the future, in the next generation as well. And what's different about this discussion of economic diversification among states within the GCC now is that they're interested in monetizing assets, particularly in their hydrocarbon industries. But still that, basic economic growth across the region still very much depends on oil and gas. That hasn't changed and won't change. So you can sell off assets and you can create value chains from these assets. And that's what, the petrochem kind of excitement is all about. What's also happening is that we're seeing more connectivity. What does that mean? It means that, in a moment where, I sit in Washington, we're talking about kind of trends in isolationism. In the Gulf states, we're seeing real interest in being part of a larger community, and that's your demand market. So that's India, China for sure, but it's beyond that. And so the biggest growth markets for this value chain are really in emerging markets, and that means Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, fast-growing economies, Pakistan, Bangladesh, as well as parts of MENA as well. So, you know, what does that mean in terms of the connectivity? Well, it makes very interesting foreign economic policy choices in terms of aid and, you know, foreign intervention in other economies, central bank support, oil and kind and gas support, FDI commitments. But it also means that in terms of the impacts of climate change, that the Gulf states, the major energy exporters, are more connected to the places which are going to be the recipients of climate impact. So Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, for sure. And these countries are where they're important demand markets for Gulf energy products, but they're also the most, you know, kind of highest growing markets for energy demand. So if we look at population growth in emerging markets, we're looking at maybe 45% increase in electricity demand in the next 10 years in these places. So that's a great opportunity if you're in the energy business. But it also means that it's complicated by many of the things that were mentioned this morning in our conversations about that equity gap, a different kind of equity gap, because the energy demand is for refrigeration, for air conditioning, these kinds of things. So the connectivity is important. The kind of value chain and diversification light strategy, I think, is important. But then if you look at the domestic side of the GCC states, there's a real interest now in governance, in delivery of services, and being more accountable for the kind of social services that governments provide, and paying for them differently. So that means, of course, the reduction of subsidies, the institution of consumption taxes, the value-added tax, sin taxes on energy drinks, sugary drinks, cigarettes, alcohol, as alternate streams of government revenue. That's great and needed to happen and will increase productivity. Productivity is another ugly word that nobody wants to talk about, but is a really, really big problem in the region. We have a redundancy of all kinds of, in labor markets. You know, you've got 8 people working at Starbucks giving you a cup of coffee. It's completely unnecessary, right? So, you know, this needs to change. And some of the, you know, and may I plug, I do have a database that's publicly available called the Gulf Economic Policy Tracker. It's on the AEI website. And we have systematically tracked every change in you know, movements to make the business climate more amenable for investor rights, insolvency, reduction of subsidies, commitments for immigration changes. And this is where we see variation across the GCC. This is why, you know, governance policy matters. So in places where there are more expatriates, like the UAE, you see a more friendly policy stance towards highly skilled foreign workers than you do in Saudi Arabia, though there also are kind of the golden visa ideas passing around in the region too. Protection of certain sectors for national employees. Oman has restricted 96 job categories to nationals, for example. So very different context there with respect to foreign workers. So anyway, we're seeing a diversity of policy response, which I think is positive. Now, your question about the intergenerational equity gap, I think, is a really important one, because all of the changes that are happening now, of course, are basically reductions or a shrinking in some ways of the state's provision of jobs, of benefits, of services, and increasing of the tax burden on citizens. Now, in places where the expatriate population is larger than the citizen population, expatriates are bearing a lot of the brunt of that tax burden. Oh gosh, are you all right?
Are you okay? I had the sun in my eyes.
It's me. She was trying to get away, and it was just like... All right. Yeah, I know. I've done it. I've really stepped in it. So where we have people who are going to be, you know, this youthful age group, which will be aging and will be facing retirement, and they will be getting less from the state as they go through this process, right? This becomes kind of a once-in-a-lifetime chance to really capture this generation and create opportunities for them. But it also is obviously a big fiscal burden on the state, and it will become more so as they get older. And in a place like Saudi Arabia, the generation behind them is smaller. So if we look at population growth in Saudi, and this is true across nationals in the GCC, people are marrying later, they're having fewer children. And so then the generation to support them is a smaller one. And so there's a nice kind of measure of this, and it's called the old age dependency ratio. So if you look at the proportion of population that is over 65 years old related to the working age population. So right now in Saudi Arabia, that older group is about 5% of the working age population. By 2050, it's going to be 30%. Right? So it's still not huge. It's not, it's not a Western European kind of demographic, but it changes the commitment of the state considerably. And so if you are cutting back on pensions, if you're cutting back on housing benefits, if you're cutting back on social services, and particularly in privatizing of healthcare, this will matter a lot. And at the same time, when you think about shared wealth and shared resources from hydrocarbon resources, like the IPO of Aramco, in which, who benefits and who got to share into that process. Well, people, not like in the Soviet Union and the post-socialist states, when you privatized a lot of state assets, citizens were given shares, right, of the postal company, of the electricity company, of the national industries. That's not what's happening. So in the longer term, will there be a sense of, well, I didn't get my due, or I haven't shared in this process of the distribution of our shared assets, whether it's through external investments in something like the PIF, or if it's in the sale or the monetization of state industry, I think can become a political football. So anyway, that was a long-winded kind of explanation of where economic diversification is not really new, but it's got a couple of new modalities, I think. And the increasing interdependence and interconnectivity of the Gulf oil and gas exporters to other developing economies, and to the shifts in policy responses across the GCC states, which I think is very exciting and healthy, in that governance is front and center, and the relationship between citizen and state is getting a good amount of attention right now. And thinking about the current kind of youth bulge as a really special generation, and how to take care of them now so you don't have to take care of them later.
Yeah, I mean, it's a completely different type of economy and whatnot, but you actually see these issues right now taking place in Western Europe and some of the European countries, Holland and others, and where all of a sudden, the increase in refugees or immigrants actually helps long-term the economy to take care of the elderly, because if they pay taxes. Well, I mean, once you're a legal citizen or have a residency. Anyway, Nicole, I think you wanted to make some comments. And
yeah, just to pick up on so many of the great comments that were made. I mean, thinking about the demographic, and in particular the intersection with the energy sector, I think about it sort of three ways that were brought up already, from the idea of the production side and how can young people participate in the production of energy and related areas. The consumption side, I think, speaking to that demand piece, which is how is this generation within the energy producing countries and outside across the region going to be consuming? What kind of energy are they going to be consuming, and how are they going to be sort of have the resources to consume? And then the governance piece. And when I think about the governance piece, it's the what in terms of the content of the governance, but also who's doing the governing. One really interesting anecdote, when you think about kind of global governance and global kind of policy and legislation, you may know the percentage of the global population under the age of 30 is over half. Roughly 55% of the world's population is under the age of 30. 2% of the world's legislators or parliamentarians are in their 20s. 15% are under 40. So when you think about that, who is doing the governing, and thinking about whether it's the energy sector or broad governance and policymaking, that political economy of governance in this region is going to need to shift in order to sort of sustain and engage the youth population. We talk about often the challenges of youth unemployment in the region and the potential security and political stability risks posed by that very high youth unemployment in Saudi and really across the region. It has the highest measured youth unemployment rates in the world. When you combine that with some of the underemployment, the low female unemployment, it is a risk. But I think the other side of that that's often left out of the conversation is that kind of governance and that broader inclusion piece. Then when we think about the demographic dividend, that comes into it as well. And also thinking about that second dividend is, again, ensuring that we have that current trained up and engaged political economy as well to kind of manage the resources going forward. So that was just an interesting, I think, different piece on the governance that I wanted to bring up. And as far as just the education, the human capital piece, I think that's been talked about. One of the things I wanted to bring in is this idea of, again, that skills gap and thinking about not only this current generation and how that education needs to shift, but what we're talking about in terms of the energy sector, but more broadly in terms of diversification, is that middle skill, those middle skill jobs, and thinking about that broader, what are those emerging sectors that can not only contribute to energy diversification, the energy economy, but also broader, and whether that's ICT, whether that's financial services, and thinking of both, on the other side, the financial inclusion of young people, financial services, the logistics industry. So these are sectors that are showing a lot of promise in the region that can also contribute to that energy economy, because you're right, there's not necessarily going to be the pace of the private sector job creation in the energy sector. And where are there jobs for sort of humans, so to speak, they tend to be at the very high end and very high skill and highly technical. And they're not necessarily going to be open to the young people, to the younger professionals that are even going into the area. So we need to think about the much broader value chains and contributing areas and how we can shift the training and think about the adult upskilling and reskilling that's going to happen, and think about adult learning systems, because again, there isn't necessarily that generation coming up behind. People are going to be likely working into their later years, again, creating that opportunity to contribute into that second demographic dividend, but it requires that other piece. And then just on the entrepreneurship, absolutely. I mean, roughly 90% of the region's businesses are small, medium-sized enterprises, and Saudi's not alone in that very low bank credit. I think the average across the region is about 7%. When you look at Europe, it's double. When you look at Asia, roughly, I think 18, near 20% of their bank credit goes to the SME sector. So that's a real gap that needs to happen in terms of the entrepreneurship side. But it's not just the financing, it's that entrepreneurial education. We hear it all the time from young people in the region that are thinking about and have the energy and enthusiasm, and not just by necessity, but want to be opportunity entrepreneurs. But it's not just the capital, they don't necessarily have the business skills. So it's that entrepreneurial skills, it's having that access to market, all of that information. I call it money, mentors, and markets when I talk about youth entrepreneurship. So just a couple other things to put in the mix.
Thanks, Nicole. Okay, so we got about 15 minutes left. I'm going to ask you to keep it short and snippy. We have Chadi, we've got Karen, we've got Cornelia, one over here. Okay, let's go to questions first. Take a few. Let's take 3, and then we'll get those answers.
Thanks a lot for a very great conversation. I have sort of comments, questions. No, don't worry, I'm always short. But obviously we need to go away from just the energy sector, because it doesn't produce the jobs that we need. So I'm coming to entrepreneurship, and I'm coming to education. I would like to go to Mr. Alturki. You're very right that we need vocational training, because not everybody can be a brain surgeon. When I look at all the visions, I look at Vision 2030, I look at all the visions across the region, it focuses way too much only on university. And there's two things. There are really good role models, like Germany, Switzerland, but you need to think of a comprehensive system of how you get that in. And B, there is also the stigma attached with not going to university, or the stigma attached of working with your hand, and that's a generational shift that needs to happen. So I would especially like to hear from Mr. Alturki what, how he thinks this can be addressed. And then with the youth bulge of today is the aging population of tomorrow. And it's not just the state that needs to provide for the pensions. You also need to go into the private or into personal accountability of looking for your pension and create again the state-regulated system so you can save for your pension. That's sort of it.
That was short. That was great. Great. Thank you. Yes, no, I'd like to echo my thanks for a diverse and rich conversation so far. And my question, I suppose, is we've been looking at these 4 countries, but very much from their domestic political agenda, of course, and also their foreign policy interests economically. But the region, of course, is rich with countries that have a myriad of different challenges. The demographic one is one that they all share, I think. But how do these 4 countries see the threat, I suppose, that is posed by the other countries in the region that don't have perhaps the, I wouldn't say the luxury, but perhaps the luck that, that some of these 4 countries do in the current context?
Okay. And then we'll go to Halima for your first question. Here.
Thank you so much. I'm Karen. I was so intrigued with what you talked about. I obviously tripped when you were talking about the whole idea that if you are sort of given shares in a national enterprise versus not being given them. And I was wondering, if you think about something like Saudi Aramco, if you're a citizen and you've bought shares, what is your expectation then on performance and on return then? Does that put new pressures on governments that wouldn't be there if you were just given those shares?
on that, and then the Aramco investments, Karen and Chadi, I think I'd like you to pitch in. Fahad, please.
Yeah. So if you look at the structure of the labor market in Saudi Arabia, you have 13 million jobs, 9.5 to expats, 3.5 million Saudis only. You see, the majority here is for non-Saudis. You have 1 million looking for jobs. So in the short term, you can solve this issue of higher degrees in the jobs without focusing on vocational training. But I agree with you, vocational training has to be looked at under the vision or under one of the programs on the vision for the long term. So you cannot replace all this 9.5 million expats, especially the blue collar jobs, with a college degree citizen. It can't be done. It has to. We have to invest, or the kingdom has to invest into vocational training, and I think it's happening. So the stigma to higher education was probably lower now than 10 years ago. If you go to Saudi Arabia now, if you go to a supermarket, you will be served by a Saudi. If you go to the mall, the retail sector, Saudis are there in the retail sector, so, which is one of the largest employing sectors. 10 years ago, that's not going to happen. So there is a need. So it's driven by need and encouraged by government to push forward into such change. Does that answer?
Yeah, we still need more comprehensive programs.
Oh yeah, on the whole education. So the education previously, it was in Saudi, in the kingdom, it was a little bit passive, I would say, in terms of responding to the demand of the students, and the students, they're looking for jobs in the government. So they want a college degree because that will give them a government position in a high rank. And the education didn't encourage other source of education that will feed into the skill needed for the private sector, because there wasn't any. But with the market growing and the diversification initiatives are being more effective than previously, I think that need is happening right now, and I think it's just a matter of time before we see the vocational training picking up for the whole system.
Nicole, on the non-hydrocarbon rich countries.
Sure.
Oh yeah, if current events are a hot topic, we can speak 3 hours about that. But please go ahead.
Sure, I'll just share some thoughts on sort of non-energy, maybe non-hydrocarbon-centric countries in the region, and kind of go back to what I mentioned before, which is thinking about what are the growth industries and opportunities as we move away from public sector. Interestingly, those some of my research lately has been on Jordan, Egypt, Tunisia, and those countries where you have had that history of the larger state, larger public employment, but it's not necessarily as dominant for a variety of reasons as some of these other countries. And it's thinking about what are the growth sectors there, again, particularly in that, for the youth perspective, in that lower to middle skill, where are those opportunities? So it's, as I said, it's care economy is actually quite a big one. And also, what are the industries that might in particular also be attractive to women and to young women, again, with incredibly low labor force participation. So care economy is one area, financial services, ICT and the digital economy, construction and logistics, hospitality and tourism are quite big. So what are those low to middle skill sectors that can be grown from a private sector, but also in particular, how do you, recognizing that the private sector jobs, the wage work just won't simply be able to keep up, which comes back to that idea of that sustainable and productive self-employment and small, medium-sized enterprise. In these economies, the SME sector, and really that micro S and M, is the micro and small more so than that medium piece. And there's some interesting work being done around, one, how do you think about non-traditional sectors and engaging women in non-traditional sectors? So for example, I was part of some work that we were doing in Jordan in training women in plumbing, maintenance, and really, really successful work and entrees into there and some really interesting opportunities. So there's that. And then you think from that, again, policy and regulation side. So Tunisia, for example, has their recent startup law, which some of you may be familiar with. The jury's still out in terms of the implementation and how what the impact of it will be. But the whole policy is around how can you incentivize and strengthen the ecosystem and incentivize entrepreneurs. In particular, they're looking at the digital economy and trying to fashion themselves and build out that digital economy. In Jordan, again, another example is going onto that broad base is looking at the home-based business law, which they recently passed and strengthened, that's trying to encourage not only women working from the home, but other cottage industry, if you will, to more formalize, be part of that tax base and that revenue growth, but also then have those protections to kind of move forward and advance and have a higher quality, have access to markets and supply chains, and so on and so forth. So I think it's thinking about some of those growth industries, and then again, where's that regional integration and some of that regional economy and trading between the countries that might be easier way to kind of grow the markets from the domestic market without necessarily, again, going kind of cross-continental.
Yeah. Karen, on Aramco, and maybe you want to
I want to weigh in on everything.
Iraq.
These are really good questions.
Okay.
On your question about kind of the Gulf states' view of weaker economies in the region, I think that's what you're pointing at, and this is a big area of research for me. I think it's fascinating. the Gulf states and the UAE in particular has a very, very strong understanding of the development security nexus. We don't talk about that in US foreign policy anymore, right? But they have a very, very sharp understanding of it. And so they're willing to deploy resources in FDI, in central bank support, in oil and gas in kind, things I mentioned before. It was $32 billion to Egypt, $3 billion to Sudan from Saudi Arabia, $3 billion to Ethiopia, $16 billion to Pakistan. This is all in the last 2 years, right? So they are emerging as major development finance actors. What's problematic, in my view, is that we don't have a very clear understanding or coordination with development agencies and IFIs of how growth happens. So we used to have shared ideas about, rule of law mattered, and there were good ways you could, make growth happen in developing economies. We don't really have those anymore. And so the deployment of this much capital for security purposes, for creating that demand market, making sure that there's going to be a middle class to buy your petroleum and petrochem products, is good. But are you creating the kinds of undergirding or institutional support that will make an economy really grow for all of its citizens? So that's, I think, a really important question that is unanswered. The question on what I think of is really of public wealth, right? And I think this is an acute question for citizens across the GCC. And it's not just in the sale of national oil companies, it's also through sovereign wealth funds. And as the sovereign wealth funds like the PF become more visible and public about where they're placing their allocations, especially in more risky investments in the technology sector, the Uber kind of investments. People, Gulf citizens are very savvy investors themselves. They know what a good stock is, right? And so that becomes then a public conversation that will have to be had. And it's coming. It's definitely coming. And in your point about, what if Aramco doesn't perform? Will people be upset? Of course they will be. I mean, ask any Kuwaiti about what happens when, the stock market fails on you. I mean, it's really, really going to be important the way that governments communicate decision-making, communicate, market shocks, and the way that they provide transparency about them. And then there was one other question. The employment kind of question. There's also cross purposes in some ways I see in the GCC. I mean, if you look at where most women are employed, most women nationals are employed in the private sector in the Gulf. Most Gulf women work in banks. Yes. Where are Gulf governments investing? Fintech. That's going to be a problem because there aren't going to be people, working as tellers. The more that fintech investments happen. So how do you create policies for investment and job creation that are aligned? Is a problem.
Chadi.
Sure. I just want to say, with respect to Aramco, to your point, Halima, maybe from the valuation perspective of Aramco, in terms of where it came in, from the government perspective, at the end of the day, that constituted a discount in terms of the population owning into the national oil company. So you combine that with what they've done in terms of extending the credit and enhancing the credit to the population. And remember, the IPO of Aramco is mostly a regional, at this stage, IPO. This could have been one of the moves in terms of saying, well, you are participating in the wealth, and only time will tell. And with that, I'd say the main issue from my perspective, and we've touched upon it, all of us, is how you manage expectations, whether from a governance perspective, because if I look at it in terms of, since I've been here for the past 10 years, I've seen younger generations lead, and especially in terms of the UAE, where I am, being given the opportunity to lead and being given the opportunity to be the decision makers and to empower them. But with that, I see the next generation even more in a hurry, and effectively, how do you address that? I mean, it's already, being youthful is being in a hurry. And then, you combine that with seeing a generation for the past 10 years who are now, when I came in, they were in their 30s, who are in their 40s, who are truly the leaders, more or less. And you see the younger generation wanting to achieve even more than the current leading generation. And you say, how do you manage these expectations when we talk about, ensuring employment, the retiring population? How do you afford them that social safety net, et cetera, et cetera? It's like a generations in a hurry, in a sense. To achieve more and more, and managing these expectations will be a challenge. Totally.
We are actually, can you make a comment afterwards? Yeah? Okay.
My comment to what he just said, because the government are giving us the opportunity to push. So that's why the youth are now being in a higher position roles, and we are trying to achieve more because the government are giving us the opportunity of education, opportunity of getting in a good jobs and everything. That's why everything is lead to being in hurry, being to achieve more, and being to attract to go more in private sector. As me, as a half local, I really wanted to start my career in private sector because I want to develop myself as because in the future maybe I'm gonna have like a government maybe role. So it's give me an opportunity to be in a private sector to build on myself and my career and everything. And all of this because of our government, because they trust us, and because the future is in our hands.
Sorry, we're short on mics here. That was, I think, a great way to actually end this session. I want to thank all the panelists for being here. Thank you all for being here. Downstairs, has already started. Our finance innovation presentation started, I think, 5 minutes ago. At 4 o'clock, we've got delivering energy access and meeting demand in South and Southeast Asia, an excellent panel in the ballroom. So thank you so much, and thank you.